This is a big one because the book that I've just read is itself so rich. It's not a huge book by the standards of someone like, I don't know, David Brin or Wheel of Time books. It's only got 275 pages, but the amount that this book crams in is phenomenal. So Norstrilia was one of the books I acquired in my November book haul, the huge book haul. I was glad to get it. I've owned this novel before, though not normally in as good condition, to be honest. But I haven't owned it for a long time. There was a stage when it was in every single op shop and second-hand shop, and then it sort of vanished and I haven't seen it for years. I haven't read it for years. And it was one that I enjoyed and reread a few times when I owned it. So it kind of jumped off the shelf at me. I was in the mood for Cordwainer Smith and his really lovely writing style. In I went. Before we talk about the story, I want to let's look at this cover. This is not by any means the original cover. You're going to have to Google for the original cover because I haven't figured out that thing where YouTubers do where they insert an image on the blank wall so you can see the alternative cover. I wish I did know how to do it, but I don't. The original was very, I guess you'd say very orange and very 60s sci-fi artwork with a guy in gold sitting on a throne and a girl in pink standing behind him. It's nice artwork and but very naff. This one is 80s artwork and it's even naffer. Naffer is not a word, never mind. Okay. So this book is a VGSF classic sci-fi number 24. This was apparently formerly Golan's classic sci-fi and it changed itself to something else. I don't think it still exists in this fashion. So 80s. So there's elements to this artwork that I do really like. I like that blue shade background of strange creatures and the futuristic space station in the sky sort of element. Those are good. Those front characters, can you imagine anything more 80s than that girl with the huge hair and that pink blousey shirt tucked into the tight jeans and the guys wearing a pink sweatshirt and that hairline, that Elon Musky type hairline? There is nothing more 80s that I can imagine than this cover. And bear in mind that considering what this cover represents, I think at this point she is meant to be the sexiest girl cat woman in the universe, and he is meant to have been turned into a cat human with whiskers. I feel they didn't do a great job with this cover. I don't hate it, but it's so 80s that it's funny. Okay, so before we talk about the book, I'd like to mention a couple of things about the author. Cordwainer Smith is a well-regarded name in science fiction. I think everyone who reads a lot of classic sci-fi has heard of him, mostly for short stories. Norstrilia, I believe, is the only novel that he has, and it didn't start out as one. It started as 2 separate books, novellas, stories, and got amalgamated. Now, while he wrote sci-fi under the pseudonym Cordwainer Smith, the actual author was Paul Myron Anthony Linebarger. His pen name Cordwainer Smith was a bit of a joke, I believe, because Cordwainer is a profession that doesn't exist anymore. I think it's rope making, I'm not sure. And Smith, obviously, is a blacksmith. Throughout this book, the language is part of what contributes to the richness of it. There are small puns in terms of names and locations. It really makes it fascinating. Anyway, Linebarger did a lot of short stories. He died, unfortunately, in 1966, just as he was starting to achieve fame and fortune in sci-fi world. In the rest of the world, he had plenty of fame and fortune. He had the most incredible life. Him and his father, if you wrote a book about them, you'd have to say you couldn't invent this stuff. It's really fascinating. Look it up. He spoke many languages. He had strong international background, ties with Asia, and he had studied and worked in strategy, warfare, and psychology. Anyway, read up on him. A couple of things, most of my reading up came now because I've never bothered before. It was only when I started looking into Norstrilia and the background of it. As an adult reading this rather than a younger person, you can see the richness and the complexity, and I became curious about the author. His father was a lawyer who worked as a judge in the Philippines, where he met Chinese nationalist Sun Yat-sen, and he became an advisor to Sun Yat-sen. While Cordwainer Smith as Paul Meyer and Anthony Lineberger, I can see how he invented the name of the protagonist here, by the way, from that long name. He was born in America so that he would have an American citizenship, but Sun Yat-sen was who was considered the father of Chinese nationalism, was also Cordwainer Smith's godfather. His young life was unsettled, the father moving around in Asia, Europe and the United States. There were a lot of boarding schools. Lineberger spoke English, was familiar with German and Chinese, and by the age of 23 he received a PhD in political science. From then on, he was a professor at some stage. After World War I, he became a second lieutenant in the United States Army. He was involved in the Office of War Information, Planning and Intelligence Board. He helped organize the Army's first psychological warfare section. It just goes on and on. It's an amazing, amazing list. So he had written a number of other things, including non-fiction, and he had other pseudonyms, but Cordwainer Smith was the one that he used for sci-fi. I think that the author's background in strategy and psychology and warfare must be what makes this such a rich novel. The universe building is extensive. The different characters and the plots intertwine in a way that I would say very few authors achieve. Many authors can manage one plot, maybe a secondary plot, one character, maybe a half a dozen side characters, but I can't think off the top of my head of many that have so many characters and side plots, each of them staying consistent with varying relevancy. So the center of this book is a character called Roderick, Frederick, Ronald, Arnold, William, MacArthur, McBann to the 151st. So Rod McBann for short. He's a male descendant of 150 other people who had previously owned the station on which he grew up in Norstrilia. And that's the long, long name that I think was influenced by Cordwainer Smith's own long name. So Rod McBann is the centre, but there's a whole heap of plots around him, and some of them duck in and touch him briefly and then swerve off, and then you've got a whole lot of plots that swirl around him further and further out, some of them very peripheral. But it is one of the richest books in terms of plots, side plots and other characters that I know. The universe is extensive. Universe building rather than world building. The world building is good too, but the universe building is extensive. I know that Cordwainer Smith has a lot of short stories collections, and a lot of those short stories are set in the same universe. So a lot of the characters and the events here actually have short stories that are relevant to them. I do want to go out and read some of them. Cordwainer Smith is one of the authors that can tempt me off my rather dubious attitude toward short stories. And you can feel that many of these characters have the weight of their own story behind them. That makes them more interesting. Now, the title, Norstrilia. It's gold, and it is so very Australian to turn a long name like Old North Australia into Norstrilia. Now, in the first part of the book, it's clear that Cordwainer Smith had a real fascination and love for Australia as it was then. So we're talking about around about World War II. Australia today is very different to then. But in some elements, it still feels very, very Australian what he's done with it. Norstrilia was published as 2 short novels, and I won't get into that yet. Okay, so it certainly comes across clearly that this was written in parts and combined to make a novel. The first section, where McMahon buys Earth, is written in a very bombastic, quirky style. It's very different to the later section when he's on Earth. And that quirky and idiosyncratic style is kind of over the top. I don't always love quirk, but the combination of Cordwainer Smith's interpretation of Australian on a foreign planet culture, which is very down to earth and matter of fact and comes across as simplistic by its own choice, that works very well with the quirky style. So the back of the book says, what happens in this story? Read it. Who's there? It starts with Rod McMahon. We know his family was distinguished. We know the poor kid was born to troubles. He was due to inherit the Station of Doom. Side note for any non-Australian watching this, what other places would call farms, or I think in America they call them ranches or properties, in Australian that's a station. It's usually huge. I once worked on a station on the Nullarbor that was larger than 3 countries that I could mention. Because they're arid, you need a large amount of land to support sheep, and there are still a lot of sheep as well as cattle. The sheep element make it into this book. Okay, he inherited the Station of Doom, which we now know was actually a ranch, if you're American. And then he gets around, he crosses all sorts of people. Samel, the most beautiful of the girly girls. Jean Jacques Vermacht, whose family preceded the human race. The wild old man at Admiralty. And that's the level of quirk that you sort of get in the first part. Now, Rod McMahon's down to earth, or you could say down to Norstrilia, and that grounds the erratic writing, but also the feeling that the author really loved Australia and that he had a sense of glee about Australian characteristics and the way Australians regarded the world. It gave that very old Australia feeling rather than modern Australia. It's an interesting but important distinction. So that first half, where you're concentrating on Rod McMahon and you're on Norstrilia, that originally appeared as The Planet Buyer in 1964, after a shorter version was published in Galaxy as the novelette The Boy Who Bought Old Earth. I'm relying on Wikipedia here, by the way. If I'm wrong, let me know. The Planet Buyer was nominated for the Hugo Award for Best Novel, but interestingly enough, I don't think the second story that contributed to this novel ever was. So, Cordwainer Smith develops the most fascinating, complex, and amazing world. So it's been settled by tough Australians. They'd already been toughened by an intermediate planet that was apparently absolute hell. And they settled this other planet, which they called Old North Australia. Very arid, like parts of Australia, but even more arid. Apparently they have to fence in their rivers to keep any moisture. And they brought sheep with them because farming sheep is what Australian sheep farmers do. When they arrived on Old North Australia, their sheep became infected with a virus, which by this stage is called the Santa Clarus virus, and which yields anti-aging drugs. They're hard to produce, and they're very, very expensive because the whole galaxy wants to live longer. And that is a theme completely absorbed me. That part of the story, even when I read it when I was younger, I loved that part. I wasn't as fussed about the second part, but I loved that early part. So as their sheep farmers become incredibly, immensely expensive, the sheep are not what you'd normally recognise as sheep. They weigh whole tons and they need to be mown to get the wool off, and the Santa Clara itself often needs to reinfect sheep. Old North Australia's managed to preserve this complete monopoly on anti-aging drugs because as soon as you take an infected sheep off the planet, it becomes well again. So the anti-aging drug doesn't exist. As well as very wealthy individuals, they're very wealthy as a planet and they're very heavily into defence of the planet. But Australians have made an active decision to remain down-to-earth farmers rather than wealthy galaxy trotting individuals. And so they tax imports very heavily, and they restrict off-planet travel to make sure that Australians are not corrupted by the rest of the galaxy. Australia has got very strong regulations on how you live your life and what you do and don't do. People can leave taking their wealth, but they're not welcome back. And that's one of the subplots later on as well. They also have a limited population. Because Australia can't support an extensive population, they made the decision to test everyone at age 16, and those who fail are killed. They kill them very humanely and happily, but they kill them. If there's a chance they will qualify for adulthood, but they haven't yet, they are regressed to a baby and allowed to grow up to 16 again and be tested. This isn't a problem because all Australians produce the anti-aging drug and they live forever. When we start with Rod McBain, he is about to be tested for the third time. He's been regressed to babyhood several times. So having been 16 3 times already, he's now in his 50s or 60s. But he's still a child. And he's also a young man. Physically, he's a young man. Legally, he's a child. And the reason he keeps being regressed is because he doesn't have the reliable telepathy that allows the rest of the Australians and large parts of the galaxy to converse telepathically, and it seems unlikely now that it will develop. It's touch and go. If he survives the testing, he becomes an adult. If he doesn't, he dies. He does survive the testing to qualify as an adult, which makes him the Mr. and owner of the Station of Doom. You've got these very colloquial, tongue-in-cheek descriptions of people, like the Mr. and Owner title and the way they talk to each other, which comes across as simplistic, but is intentionally so. Now, after Rod becomes qualifies as an adult, there's a blowout party at his station. That's very Australian, can I tell you? By the way, I'm wearing an Australian Boulder opal at the moment in honour of this book. You can't see it too well, it's purple. So after the blowout, someone comes and warns Rod that rather than settling down to get married, live his long life as a station owner, someone has it in for him and is likely to be killed. One attempt on his life is made, and then Rod, in self-defense, buys the Earth and most of Australia. Now, having done that, Rod is forced to run away from Australia to escape repercussions. And that's when the second portion of the book starts. The second portion was apparently originally published in shorter form in 1964 in Galaxy's sister magazine, If. It was published as The Store of Heart's Desire. It was published posthumously as The Underpeople in 1968 because Cordwainer Smith died in 1966. And it says that it wasn't until 1975 that the complete text of the novel was published in one paperback volume. Honestly, it was hard for me to trace the ins and outs of this book. So correct me by all means. Different websites give different information. Eventually I just gave up. It's a great book. The melding together of stories isn't seamless. Now, so in the second half, when Rob's been taken to Earth, it starts off with a certain amount of quirk, but once he gets there, he's transformed to an underperson. So that's a combination of an animal, in this case a cat, and a man. This is something they do on Earth, but Rod's never encountered it before because their underpeople are forbidden on Norstrilia. Now, it seems like underpeople are a major cornerpoint not only of old Earth, but of the galaxy. It's some sort of genetic combination so that you have cat characteristics or dog characteristics or bear characteristics, but you still have the ability to think and cogitate like a human. Anywho, this second part becomes a lot more strategic. There's a lot of plot threads, a lot of secondary characters. The writing isn't anywhere near as idiosyncratic. It's a lot more materialistic. No, that's not the word. It's a lot more practical, and it doesn't have fun with its own writing as much as the first part does. There's kudos to the author for keeping all the plots and characters distinct and separate and easy to tell apart, and part of that was the names. Apparently Cordwainer Smith is known for having fun with names, in the same way that he did with his own pseudonym, Cordwainer Smith, 2 different types of crafters put together. Many of these names come from other languages, sometimes a number of other languages in the same place. That's a whole rabbit hole you can dive into, but many of these names are actually numbers in other languages, like Mandarin and stuff. It's pretty wild. Read up on it if you're interested. So unlike the straightforwardness of the first part, it's very convoluted, and there's a lot of social commentary, a lot. The whole being human and the plight of the underpeople are explored as part of the story, but strongly. They're treated by contempt with the true humans. They're expendable. More can be grown from vats. They have no rights, basically, in civilization, and it's difficult to imagine that this was anything but a social commentary on America, because when this was written in the 60s, I'm not big on American history, but I gather it was a time of turbulence, because of course slavery in America would have felt very similar to the slaves, that is, as being an underperson would have felt to an underperson in this universe galaxy that Cordwainer Smith has built. I also think that just before this was published, or around about the same time this was published, there were whole lots of acts being brought out to give equal human status to people despite the colour of their skin in America. Anyway, don't want to get into American politics, don't understand them very well. Now, as well as the African-American situation, Cordwainer Smith and his father both had very strong ties to Asia, a good understanding and rapport with the various cultures. They'd lived in many of them, they spoke some of the languages, they had ties. And at the time, I believe Asians were also treated poorly in the US, and that must have been incredibly galling to a mature author who was acquainted with those incredibly rich cultures, phenomenal languages, the long traditions that Asia has. And to see them regarded as second-class citizens in America can't have been fun. So I think that the second part is, in its inimicable way, very much a commentary on all of that. So, while the second part is very engrossing to read, and I enjoyed the actual reading of it, it lacks the story integrity of the first part. And it does lack the charm of the first part. It doesn't have the joy in the writing style. It can feel a bit socially preachy and can be a little bit too complicated at times. But the carefully constructed society, the animal people, the underpeople, where they live actually underground, and everything is very well written. It's well fleshed out. There's lots of interesting scenes of old Earth seen through Rod's eyes, who's never left Australia before. So, it's a good portion, but it does feel still very much like a separate book to the first one. Now, in that last bit, we have a point. I guess it's not spoilers, it's from 66, for goodness sake. How can you spoil something from 66? There are a couple of points where the author's background in psychology is brought in, and there's one particular sequence that comes straight from a psychology background, and there's a cat person called Sir William. Oh yes, the underpeople, whatever species they came from, their name has in front of it. So Rod is turned into a cat person, he becomes Sir Rod, and he's shown around by the most amazing, sexy, voluptuous, gorgeous woman who's ever existed, Sir Mel, who's a combination of a cat and a person, and bears no resemblance to that 80s pink blouse, except that she has red hair. Just saying that because I can't not say that. So yes, Rod gets strongly psychoanalyzed, and well, I feel like Cordwainer Smith wanted to write it because of his background in psychology, and it feels forced and rather pointless. It doesn't give us really any important information about Rod, though it's a little bit interesting to know a bit more about his background and how his parents died, but it's not significant. It doesn't really change him significantly. It doesn't seem to really achieve anything. It's fun enough to read, But it's one of those things in the second portion of the book where you've got to wonder what exactly the point is. An interesting thing about that is that while I was reading it, I wasn't wondering what's the point of this time. But when I first read it, when I must have been about, I don't know, 21 or something, the second part felt pointless. I would often reread the first part, but I'd lose interest a little bit in the second. I just didn't enjoy it as much. It was too convoluted. I couldn't see the social politics as much as I can today. So that's just a caution, perhaps a little bit of a caution, depending on who you are and what your reading style is. It may well be that the first story is the one for you, but the second one may not be. Don't beat yourself up. Enjoy what you can and leave what you can't. Now, as well as that, leading up to the end, Rod finally meets the leader of the Underpeople, and you've got this sort of semi-religious sequence that I don't quite get. Cordwainer Smith, of course, was American, more into religion. I think he belonged to a Christian religion, I'm not sure which one. It was all a bit mystical, and it led to an ending, and the conclusion, the ending, felt to me a bit like the author just got sick of the boy that earned the earth theme, because now he doesn't anymore, and then went for a fast, happy ending. I didn't hate the ending. Didn't quite see the point of it. You've got a lot of complexity to the galaxy that comes into that ending, and that complexity would come from other stories. So I think if I'd read more of the other short stories that he has in this galaxy, a lot of other things would have tied in. So we've got the Catwoman Samel is apparently a bit of a legend among her among her own people. So there's obviously a short story about that out there somewhere. Their leader, thank goodness the book tells you how to pronounce this, because otherwise I wouldn't be able to. Kelly was apparently developed from eagles in pursuit of another species that inhabits the galaxy and used to build architecture. And that's a whole other story, and it's fascinating, and I loved every bit of it. And I'm sure there's short stories out there that will allow me to delve into that more. There's an instrumentality. An instrumentality is apparently a governing force of the galaxy, and it isn't gone into in any great detail here, except that it's one of the forces that are working on Rod. Now, Rod McBain himself is a very enjoyable character. At no point do I stop enjoying his story. In the first part of the book, he's more of a mover. It's about him, told through his point of view, and he is a strong character in his own right on Norstrilia in his Station of Doom, where he's lived all his life, as have 150 of his ancestors. And that's great. I love that part. The second part, the story, he's more being acted upon. He's forced to leave Norstrilia if he wants to survive. Then he's forced to transform into a cat person, and he kind of goes along with all this. In fact, he was forced to buy the earth, and he kind of went along with that as well. In the second part, he feels like he's being acted upon rather than an actor. And that's a great way of seeing the story, seeing the earth, seeing everything that happens and the culture around it. So it works. But he's not an active hero. He's no Earl Dumarest. He's no cowboy hero. I don't think everyone loves this subtlety to his character that you get in the second part of the novel. And Cordwainer Smith himself actually makes a reference to that at one point, where Rod feels like he says he just feels like he isn't actually doing anything, he's just being pushed around by other forces. And the person he's talking to says, yes, well, aren't we all, sort of thing. So yes, for one, not that huge book, there's so much in it, and it's all so good. I sound as if I'm complaining a lot about things, but most of these things strike you after you've finished the reading experience and you're analysing the book. While you're reading it, you're just reading it, and it's a lot of fun, and I do thoroughly recommend it. Sorry for this extensively long book review. But in honestly, I could probably talk about this book for 3 hours straight. There is so much, and there's so many rabbit holes to go down. Try it, read it. If you love classic sci-fi and you haven't read it, you are in for a treat, and you've been missing out. So, read it. And if you have read it, comment. And if you understand the background, tell me about that. And YouTube likes it if you subscribe, so do that too, maybe, if you want to.